Hat, sunglasses, Pepsi, notes, sources, thick skin, check. You already know. Let's go. Golden Blooded is a college football YouTube channel for entertainment. So make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and let's get into our next college football video. Well, in this video, I wanted to talk about the Peach Bowl, the first round of the playoffs between the number 4 Ohio State Buckeyes and the number 1 Georgia Bulldogs, and who I think will win this game and how much of a chance Ohio State has to actually win this game. But the first question is, does Ohio State even deserve to be in the playoffs? In my opinion, no, I don't think so. I think if you don't make your conference championship, you should not make the 4-team playoffs. Now, once it stretches out to 12 teams, that's a whole different story. But in this 4-team playoffs, if you didn't make your conference championship, you shouldn't be in the playoffs. And I know, Alabama made it to the playoffs a while back without winning their division, and they went on to win the whole thing. But that doesn't mean that they earned their way in. That means once they got in, they were the best team that got into the playoffs. But they didn't earn their way in. Same thing with Ohio State. Even if they go on to win the whole enchilada, the national championship, I don't think that they've earned their way into the national championship. Golden Blooded, they just happened to play in the Big Ten East and lost to one team, Michigan. I understand that. But the total record of their opponents that they played, 76-70. Compare that to Georgia's. Not counting LSU, the total record of their opponents, 85-60. If you count LSU, 94-63. So no, that argument doesn't hold any water. So if I don't think Ohio State should have made the playoffs, who should have made the playoffs over Ohio State? Well, there's several candidates. The first candidate is actually the AAC champion, number 16 Tulane. 11-2, they're the AAC champs. That's pretty close, but yeah, they did make their conference championship, and they won their conference championship. So as far as earning the spot in the playoffs, yeah, I think Tulane would have earned it over Ohio State. And I'm not saying Tulane is a better team than Ohio State. The second team is number 7 Clemson, who finished 11-2, ACC champs. Yes, I think Clemson most certainly earned their way into the playoffs over Ohio State. The next candidate would be number 9 Kansas State. Now, they finished 10-3, but still Big 12 champs. But they do have less of an argument because they have more losses and less wins. The next candidate is number 10 USC. No, they didn't win the Pac-12 championship, but they got there finishing 11-2, the Pac-12 runner-up. And if you think about it, they just lost to one team as well. They just lost to them twice. So we're punishing USC losing to the same team that they lost to in the regular season. I think if Ohio State and Michigan were in separate divisions, Michigan beat them in the first game, and they had a rematch in the Big Ten Championship, I think Michigan would have beat them again. So yes, I would have put USC in over Ohio State. And then finally, the Pac-12 champs, number 8 Utah, they finished 10-3, but they also have less wins and more losses. So I would say either Clemson or USC. And honestly, I would lean towards USC. And I know they're not the conference champions, but really, they just lost to one team. You're punishing them for making the conference championship. And you're rewarding Ohio State for not making the conference championship. That makes no sense to me. On to the actual matchup. Who has the better offense and who has the better defense? That's the first question we have to answer. Well, for offense, Ohio State averaged 294.2 passing yards a game. Running the ball, they averaged 198.5 rushing yards a game. And overall, they averaged 492.7 yards a game. For Georgia, they averaged 284.9 passing yards a game and averaged 207 rushing yards a game. Overall, 491.9 yards a game. So Ohio State has a slightly better offense, mainly due to their passing game, but Georgia has a slightly better rushing game. What about defense? Well, Georgia allows 215.1 passing yards a game. They allow 77 rushing yards a game. Overall, they allow 292.1 yards a game. For Ohio State, they allow 184 passing yards a game, 119.9 rushing yards a game. Overall, 303.9 yards a game. So Georgia does have the better defense. Not by much, though. That surprised me. This is close. Ohio State actually has the better passing defense, but Georgia has the better rushing defense. So that was close as well. But I'll give the check mark to Georgia on the defensive side of the ball. As far as points, because that's what decides these games, right? Georgia averages 39.2 points per game, which is 11th. Ohio State averages 44.5 points per game, which is 2nd. So that reaffirms that Ohio State does have the better offense. Now for Georgia, they allow 12.8 points per game, which is 2nd. And Ohio State allows 19.2 points per game, which is 13th. So that also reaffirms that Georgia has the better defense. Now let's take a look at what they did in the regular season. What I want to do is look at the teams that they played, look at how they did against those teams. That way we can see what this matchup looks like. First up, the players. For Ohio State quarterback C.J. Stroud, 235 for 355, that's 66.2%. Threw for 3,340 yards, 37 touchdowns, just 6 interceptions. Slight don't threat quarterback, 35 carries for 74 yards, 2.1 yards a carry. Georgia's Stetson Bennett, 269 for 396. That's 67.9%, threw for 3,425 yards, 20 touchdowns, just 6 interceptions. Also a slight dual threat quarterback, 47 carries for 184 yards. That's 3.9 yards a carry and 7 touchdowns. So Stetson Bennett actually threw for more passing yards than C.J. Stroud, but C.J. Stroud threw more touchdowns. So I think the quarterback battle is actually pretty even. Stetson Bennett is better than people give him credit for. What about the running game? Ohio State's best running back is Mayan Williams, 125 carries for 817 yards. That's 6.5 yards a carry and 13 touchdowns. I do think if Ohio State committed to the run more, they would actually have more success. For Georgia, they go running back by committee. Kendall Milton, Kenny McIntosh, and Dejon Edwards. Georgia likes to lean on you and wear you out. Yes, Ohio State definitely has to worry about that. Ohio State's leading receiver, Marvin Harrison Jr., 72 receptions for 1,157 yards and 12 touchdowns. Of course, Georgia's leading receiver is actually a tight end. That's Brock Bowers, arguably the best tight end in the entire nation. 52 receptions for 726 yards and 6 touchdowns. So I think Ohio State has the slight advantage in the passing game, but Georgia has the major advantage in the rushing game. So here's a look at what these two teams did during the regular season, comparing the final score to what they averaged and to what their opponents averaged as well. First, we'll talk about Ohio State. Here's what their schedule looked like. First game, they played number 5 Notre Dame, who finished the season strong, 8-4. Beat them 21-10. Notre Dame averages 30.7 points per game and allows 21.8 points per game. So overall, Ohio State underperformed offensively, but overperformed defensively. Next game, Arkansas State out of the Sun Belt. They averaged 25 points per game, allowed 31.4 points per game. Ohio State beat them 45-12. Ohio State overperformed on both sides of the ball. Next opponent, Toledo, who finished 8-5. Final score was 77-21. Toledo averaged 32.1 points per game and allowed 25.5 points per game. So once again, Ohio State overperformed on both sides of the ball. Next team was Wisconsin, who finished 6-6. Wisconsin averaged 26.5 points per game and allowed 20.5 points per game. Final score was 52-21. So once again, Ohio State overperformed on both sides of the ball. They played Rutgers, who finished 4-8. Final score was 49-10. Rutgers averaged just 17.4 points per game and allowed 29.8 points per game. So Ohio State overperformed on both sides of the ball. Then they went on the road to Michigan State, beat them 49-20. Michigan State finished 5-7. They averaged 24.4 points per game and allowed 27.4 points per game. So once again, Ohio State overperformed. So far, so good for Ohio State. Only one shaky game, and that was against Notre Dame. And that was only on the offensive side of the ball. Next game was against Iowa, who finished 7-5. Iowa averaged 17.4 points per game and allowed 14.4 points per game. Ohio State beat them 54-10. So once again, Ohio State overperforms on both sides of the ball. And they go on the road and play number 13 Penn State. Penn State finished 10-2. They were a pretty good team. Ohio State wins that football game 44-31. Penn State averaged 35.8 points per game, which is 19th, and allowed 18 points per game, which was 10th. So Ohio State most definitely overperformed on the offensive side of the ball, but they definitely underperformed on the defensive side of the ball. Next game, on the road to Northwestern, who finished 1-11. They weren't just bad, they were really, really bad. Northwestern averaged 13.8 points per game and allowed 28.3 points per game. Now, Ohio State did good on defense, but they definitely underperformed on offense. And that's something to worry about because that's what they lean on the most is their offense. The next game was Indiana, who finished 4-8. Ohio State beat them 56-14. Indiana averaged 23.2 points per game and allowed 33.9 points per game. So once again, Ohio State overperforms on both sides of the ball. Then on the road to Maryland, who finished 7-5. Maryland averaged 29.2 points per game and allowed 24.1 points per game. Ohio State beat Maryland 43-30, overperformed on the offensive side of the ball, but definitely underperformed on the defensive side of the ball. So not a great game for Ohio State. And then finally, of course, number 3, Michigan. Michigan finished the regular season 13-0, Big Ten champs. And of course, Ohio State lost this game 45-23. Michigan averaged 40.1 points per game and allowed 13.4 points per game. And Ohio State failed that test miserably. And this was a home game. They by far underperformed on both sides of the ball. All this falls on the arguments that I think Ohio State did not earn their way in the playoffs. So let's look at Georgia's season. How did they do besides their record? First up, number 11, Oregon in Atlanta. Oregon finished 9-3. Georgia whooped them 49-3. Oregon averaged 39.7 points per game and allowed 27.4 points per game. So Georgia majorly overperformed on both sides of the ball. Next up, FCS Sanford. And the only reason I'm even mentioning this game is Sanford was actually a pretty good FCS team. They finished 11-2. Georgia whooped them 33-0. Sanford averaged 32.7 points per game, allowed 25.4 points per game, and of course, Georgia overperformed on both sides of the ball. Then they went on the road, played South Carolina, finished the regular season 8-4, whooped South Carolina 48-7. South Carolina averaged 31.7 points per game and allowed 27.5 points per game. Georgia majorly overperformed on both sides of the ball. After that, Kent State, who finished 5-7, Georgia wins that game 39-22. Kent State averaged 28.4 points per game and allowed 29 points per game. So Georgia performed on par against Kent State as far as offensively, but they definitely underperformed on defense. Next game at Missouri. Missouri finished 6-6. This was a shaky game for Georgia. They did win the game 26-22. Missouri averaged 25.5 points per game and allowed 25 points per game. Georgia underperformed on both sides of the ball in this game. Then they played Auburn, who finished 5-7. Georgia won 42-10. Auburn averaged 24.8 points per game and allowed 29.5 points per game. So, of course, Georgia majorly overperformed on both sides of the ball. Then there was Vanderbilt, who finished 5-7. They were a better team this year, but Georgia was way too much, beating them 55-0. Vanderbilt averaged 24.6 points per game, allowed 36 points per game. Georgia majorly overperformed on both sides of the ball against Vanderbilt. And they played an average Florida. 6-6 they finished. Georgia beats them 42-20. Florida averaged 31.8 points per game and allowed 28.8 points per game. So Georgia overperformed on both sides of the ball, but only by a little bit. After that, they played number 1 Tennessee, who finished 10-2. Beat Tennessee 27-13. Tennessee averaged 47.3 points per game and allowed 23.5 points per game. Even though they won this football game, they underperformed on both sides of the ball. Now, only barely on the defensive side of the ball, but definitely majorly on the offensive side of the ball. And they went on the road and beat Mississippi State, who finished 8-4. Won that game 45-19. Mississippi State averaged 32.7 points per game and allowed 24.2 points per game. Georgia overperformed on the offensive side of the ball, but slightly underperformed on the defensive side of the ball. And they go on the road and beat Kentucky, who finished 5 16-6. Kentucky averaged 22.1 points per game and allowed 19.1 points per game. On defense, Georgia was fine. They overperformed. But on offense, they definitely majorly underperformed. And finally, Georgia Tech, who finished 5-7. Georgia won that game 37-14. Georgia Tech averaged 17.2 points per game and allowed 28.4 points per game. But Georgia actually underperformed on both sides of the ball, but only by a little bit. Only by a little bit. Then, of course, the SEC championship game against number 10 LSU, who finished 9-4. They beat LSU 50-30. LSU averaged 32.3 points per game and allowed 23.7 points per game. Georgia did overperform on the offensive side of the ball, but they actually underperformed on the defensive side of the ball. So Georgia had a few close games, and for the most part, they struggled on the offensive side of the ball when they did struggle. But for Ohio State, they struggled on both sides of the ball. The biggest issue that I saw with Ohio State against Michigan is allowing those big plays. There were 4 touchdowns, whether it was a passing touchdown or a rushing touchdown, that were over 45 yards. They have got to limit that if they want any shot of beating Georgia. And I'm not sure if they can do that because Georgia is also pretty good at big plays. Georgia and Michigan are very comparable, and that was a home game for Ohio State. So if Ohio State wants any shot of winning this game, they have to get better on the defensive side of the ball, not the offensive side of the ball. I think Ohio State can put points up on this Georgia defense, but my biggest concern is, can they stop this Georgia offense? This Georgia offense is much better than what it was last year, and I think the answer to that is no. I think Brock Bowers is going to be a major issue for the Ohio State defense, and I also think that Stetson Bennett will hurt that Ohio State defense with his legs. Not saying he's going to run for 100 yards, but he'll be able to get those short down to go distance to get that first down, either on second or third down. And I think Georgia will wear out that Ohio State defense. That Georgia offensive line is massive, and Georgia keeps a fresh running back in consistently, and they're all really, really good. I just don't see any way of Ohio State winning this football game. I'm sorry, Ohio State fans. I wish I had better news. I just think Georgia is the overall better football team. Now, if Michigan goes on to beat TCU like I think they will, that's a different story. I think that's going to be one heck of a football game. And I think Michigan matches up against Georgia way better. And I think it's going to be a completely different story than what we saw from last year. So yeah, I'm kind of adding on to the pile. I don't think Ohio State beats Georgia. I don't even think it's going to be close. And I think Michigan could be a real contender for the national championship this year. Not really what Ohio State fans wanted to hear from this video. So y'all let me know in the comment section, how much of a chance do you give Ohio State to beat Georgia? And do you think that Ohio State earned their way into the playoffs? Do you actually think they're one of the 4 best teams in the nation now that you know how weak their schedule is and they didn't even win their division? I know they only had 1 loss, but they didn't get to their conference championship, and USC was punished for getting to their conference championship and losing to the same team that they lost in the regular season. That's all I got for you for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.